Our next storyteller is Helen J. Collier. Let's see here. Let's put here for everyone. Helen Collier, a prolific writer of many different genres, says writing has been in her spirit since her mother placed a pen in her left hand and told her, God made you left-handed writer for a reason. It's up to you to share it with the world, whatever that reason is. A native of Illinois, she now resides in Auburn, Washington. Miss Helen has publications entitled The Last Judgment, Looking for Trouble, My Oprah, and Recreating the Legacy. She also has a trilogy, including Miss Anna and the Tears from the Healing Tree, The Two Worlds of Miss Anna, and Miss Anna, the Promise Keeper. And her last series, The Unexpected, and the sequel, The Unexpected 2, 2020, the year when the face of America changed. Miss Helen.
Good evening. I'm honored to be here this evening, sharing a little bit about my life before coming to Seattle to live. I was born and raised in the Midwest in East St. Louis, Illinois. It was once a thriving city with 2 hospitals. After the city became 90% Black, the 2 hospitals were abandoned. In 1917, it was estimated in the city that during a race riot, 320 African Americans were shot, many killed while trying to escape the fire of their burning homes that occurred over a labor dispute. We live with the scars of that horror even today. Growing up, I lived a while in Haynesville, Louisiana during the Jim Crow era, when Black Americans were imprisoned or lynched if we did not comply with the cruel Jim Crow laws enforced against us in the South. As a storyteller, I use magical realism and science fiction within the boundaries of my imagination, but my stories are about real people. This evening, I am sharing with you the history of my female ancestors' lives as a storyteller through magical realism from a short excerpt of my novel, The Unexpected. My protagonist is a 21-year-old white female college student in conflict with her 3 African-American history classmates who has challenged her to research and give an oral report on the life of the African female slave in America, whose life she believed was not as bad as they claimed it to have been. The challenge caused Dawn much concern until she had an unexpected encounter with a 7-foot catfish trapped inside a gate along the Connecticut River. The fish needed help to free itself. In return, it offered to take her back in time so she could research and get the information for her report, a report that was, needless to say, unexpected. As bad as history might seem to them, Dawn knew Tony, Shirley, and Tina had no understanding of the depth of horror slaves lived. As she now stood in her own century, Dawn was aware that a new and different era was already evolving. She wondered what that evolutionary change would look like for those yet to be born. There is no such history as Black history in our country. Dawn's voice rang out loudly and clearly as she stared at her classmates and the instructor who sat in the audience with the students. Everything that has occurred in this country is every American's history, bad and good. Her fingers trembled, but she knew her report had to be given. It is about us as a people and the choices and decisions made by our ancestors hundreds of years ago. Those choices and decisions have brought us to the present day. My report speaks of one aspect of that history, the life of the American female slave. Dawn took a deep breath and continued. My research led me to a time in history I had no understanding of. It wasn't that I didn't know this period in history happened, but now realize why it is history we as white Americans no longer want to discuss. My findings mandated that I ask one of the most disturbing questions of history. Looking at her classmates, Dawn took another deep breath and asked, How much mind altering did it take to convince an entire nation of people that building our country through the suffering, mutilation, rape, and enslavement of other humans was their Christian duty? I say nation because the North is just as much a part of this history as the South, a tragic history that as a white American, I must revisit centuries later. Had it not been for my thorough research, no one ever could have made me believe slavery for the slave woman could have possibly been that horrific. Her life was the worst in the history of our nation for any woman to endure. She endured it for nearly 300 years. In cotton fields, she toiled carrying babies soon to be born. You can't tell them that the babies would tremble to death. They won't believe it's true. It was the voice of the catfish. Don shivered, envisioning the hoof of the overseer's horse trampling the baby to death. Treated worse than if she were an animal, work for this female started before daybreak. In fields and in plantation houses, she slaved only to return to her shack, unable to sufficiently feed herself or her children. Don realized she couldn't tell them about the food the mistress had her starving slave women throw to the dogs. They wouldn't want to believe that either. How could she have known? She wouldn't have believed that it was possible had she not seen it with her own eyes. While it is true some female slaves lived inside the master's house, even those slaves could be summoned at any time for any reason. Their duties had to be fulfilled day or night, just as if they were working in the fields. Their lives, just as those in the fields, belonged to their masters. Though their work differed, the treatment they received played out the same. No woman in this room can imagine giving birth to babies owned by someone else, babies that could be sold at any time for any reason. The slave woman's most important job was having children owned by only her master. Her womb was all with the sperm of any slave or white male her body was mated with. She was sexually exploited by many races of men for nearly 3 centuries. It's American history, a way of life drawn up for the slave woman through no fault of her own. Dawn stopped and took another deep breath. Her eyes became teary as she remembered the trauma of the mating party and its cruel purpose. Had it not been for Meow, Dawn was destined to live oblivious to that part of American history. The telling of it brought the horrors back fresh in her mind. Tears filled her eyes. She needed to hurry and finish. The female slave became the means by which the slave masters replenished their labor force. Her body was used to give birth for anyone who owned her, sometimes being sold 7 or 8 times before her death. If her master or mistress were lucky, many of their slave women produced 20 or more babies in their lifetime, most sold away from them. Dawn paused as gasps could be heard throughout the classroom. She knew those students could never have endured any of what she witnessed. The slave family concept was not real because a slave could be sold at any time. Slave fathers' ability to protect their family was for the most part unheard of. Like with any of the slave master's animals, the male had no say in the births he was responsible for. That's the truth, Tina said, then covered her mouth as if surprised she could be heard. Slave owners had no need for real families or slave fathers because all slaves belonged to them. Most mating of the female took place with multiple mates so that no father could be known. Even when the pregnancy resulted from the masters mating with the females, those babies were sold the same as the rest. No difference was made between the slave master's children and the children by the slave male. If the slave master or his wife chose to sell a slave, black or white, they were sold. Don watched Tony uncross his leg as he rubbed the back of his fair skin, reminding Don that he also carried the genes of an unknown white male, the same as Maybe's babies and many of other slaves she had seen on the judge's plantation. The white color was all the people of that day thought was passed to the offspring. No one realized that the genes of the master also made up those babies. He unknowingly was reproducing himself. The slave woman gave birth not knowing how long her children would be with her before they were sold. Children she begged to be allowed to keep. Dawn thought of the mistress' benediction for Maybe's baby. Her head bent towards the ground, she moved through life having no idea when her circumstances would suddenly change and she might find herself sold to a new master, her body used by different mates in her new slave environment. Dawn understood why Maybe never talked to her babies. Why would she? The horrors of her life began as soon as she was thought to be old enough to work and ended when death took her out of her miserable existence. That would not be something a mother would want to tell her daughters. Ooh, your research is thorough, sister girl, Shirley said, raising her hand to cover her mouth. She was born in this country with no understanding of what race meant or why it sealed her fate to live the life of a slave until her death. Dawn stared at the students, hearing Minnie's voice. My Toby is no different than me. It was the same way she learned to see Maybe, a woman living a different life, but with the same pain, happiness, sadness, and most of all, love. No different than her own emotions. No female on this earth should have had to endure those conditions. Yet, it is our nation's history, a history that should never be forgotten or repeated on this planet. Startled faces gazed at her. Dawn looked beyond her classmates as Maybe's life flooded her thoughts. She remembered she and Maybe pushing rags in between the cracks in the walls to keep the rain from pouring in on them. They ended up squeezed together in a corner of Maybe's shack where the roof was solid, hoping the two babies would stay dry. Waking up half asleep, the two had taken the babies to the old women's shack and headed out to the fields where cotton waited to be picked. There's always a power beyond human depravity, Dawn said as she stared at her audience. God in his mercy graced the slave woman with love for the children who came and went from her body, her arms, and soon her life. For her children, she lived colorblind, loving them no matter what color or condition they came to her. She held that little bit of love under her breast, a love that burned in her heart long after they were sold. It was a love that could not be destroyed, even though many times it came to her whitewashed. Dawn took a deep breath as she remembered Maybe's last words the night before sleep overtook them both. Tell them, Dawn, how it was for the slave woman in her life. Tell them so they won't forget about us. Both their tears had fallen as Dawn wrapped her arms around Maybe. It is our country's history, she said, a history where American women existed in skeletal bodies producing babies to ensure the survival of free labor in this nation. Her mind inside Maybe's world, Dawn said to her classmates, there has never been, to my knowledge, any psychological studies on the generational traumas of the female slave. Who knows or understands the damage done to her and her offspring because of those atrocities endured during that time in American history? The students and the instructors said with open mouths. What we do know is that to this day, her descendants still carry those scars. That is why it is impossible to equate the condition of immigrant people from other countries with the descendant of the African slaves brought to this country. The Africans who sold other Africans from the continent of Africa have no idea how they destroyed those lives. She saw the African exchange students look at each other and shake their heads. After being taken as a slave, I believe all that was needed was a little kindness to get what their owners desired from them. Instead, my research led me to a history of brutal force and racial breeding used to gain our nation's wealth. The slave masters destroyed what the slave could have become for them and corrupted the very principles our nation put in place after the Revolutionary War. Dawn gazed into faces that held looks of shock. There was nothing humane, as I once believed, about the treatment of the slave woman during that time in our history. As a result, the legacy of democracy we offer the rest of the world has always been compromised. Even the Civil War, which was said to have freed the slaves, was never fought for that purpose. In truth, it was fought to determine whether the North or the South would control this nation. To her surprise, neither Tony, Shirley, or Tina said a word to discredit her report, yet their mouths stood ajar as Don continued uninterrupted. After the Civil War, we failed to keep our promises to those still under our power, not caring that they gave their lives to help us win that war. As a newly freed person, I too would have struggled to understand what freedom meant for me. The nation's failure to keep promises made to those freed people created a history as bizarre as that troubled system many fought to end. For another 100 years, we used the tyranny of Jim Crow law to continue the destruction of the former slave woman's life, allowing white men to enter her home and sexually violate her, even with a husband, a father, or other male relatives living in the home, no different than her slave life. Few, if any, Americans want to remember that time in history, but it is American history. Our ancestors' decision and action caused that history. I don't believe even today we have figured out where they went wrong or how to right those wrongs. For that reason, it is a part of our American history we are now living to regret. Dawn stared beyond the students who looked at her, dumbfounded, as she moved to leave the podium.